Hello and welcome to Eavesdropping at the Movies. I'm Mike.
And I'm Jose.
And today we've seen Ken Loach's possibly last film. He's 87 years old now, which is a reasonable time to stop, and he said this might be his last film. It's called The Old Oak. We saw his last film, Sorry We Missed You, for the podcast, and we both liked it on balance, but issues here and there, I think, as we tend to do with Ken Loach, but we liked it. That was his film about the gig economy, amongst other things. And before we started doing the podcast, we had seen I, Daniel Blake together, which was a film that kind of re-catapulted him into people's minds, I think. It was quite big.
It certainly made an impact, right?
Yeah, so you fondly remember at the end of that film we saw it with, there was an audience of maybe 10 people, roughly. And that was the film about the benefit system set in Newcastle. And at the end of the film, when we were getting up to leave, one guy 3 or 4 rows behind us stood up and said loudly, "We are the 5th richest economy in the world, and this is a disgrace." Yes. I remember exactly what he said.
He was so angry.
Yeah.
And I was so impressed, that a film should get that effect, right?
Right, bring that out of someone.
Yeah. So it made me rethink Loach a little bit, because I've never liked him. I always thought he was too preachy, too didactic, not visually, not poetic with his visuals. Yeah. Right? It felt like you were being clobbered over the head with things you already know.
He's visually fairly blunt, and I suppose in some sense you could maybe say objective, but I think to me, that would be another way of saying, as you say, he's not poetic, he's not finding insightful, imaginative ways of showing things. It's telling.
He doesn't dramatize visually, that's for sure.
So this film,
or sonically.
So the film is about Syrian refugees, and one family in particular who are relocated to a town in County Durham. We're not told exactly where. It might as well be a fictional town. Other places are kind of mentioned, but we're just told at the start of the film the north of England.
Yeah, it's a former mining town, which is important,
as they all are. It's heavy mining. Basically, everywhere kind of. I mean, really anywhere, but especially north of kind of the Watford Gap, had a mining community associated with it. And especially the further north you go. The former mining community aspect comes into the film because the film draws a parallel or a connection between the Syrian refugees who have been forced by circumstances to escape the Assad regime to move to Durham, and the former mine communities who work there, and this one particular thing about when you eat together, you stick together. And so in the back room of this pub, the Old Oak, which is where our main character, I say because our main character is not a Syrian refugee, our main character owns the pub, and he befriends the family. And in the back room of this pub, which has been closed for ages, there are all these photos from the 1980s miner strikes, and people sat together, congregated in that room, eating together, and it was a thing about solidarity. Yes. And the film very effectively, I think, draws this parallel. It says exactly the same thing. We all eat together. And then Yara, who is the young woman who he is closest to, says pretty much the same thing, that when we were in the Syrian camps, we did exactly the same thing. It's the same thing. I found that very effective. I found quite a lot of the film very effective, actually.
Did you?
I was wondering what you would think about it, because I can never really tell if it's going to be, oh, I love this, or I couldn't stand it with you.
Well, I mean, I thought it was very blunt. I thought it was him giving you information of things we already know. I found that I can't disagree with any of it. I agree with all his politics. But, as an aesthetic experience of the cinema, I found it very lacking, right? The moment that most affected me was the killing of his dog and his response to it. And that's about the cheapest trick in the book in terms of, storytelling. Like, you kill the dog and everyone responds. And that is what I responded to most in this film, where really I should have been responding, to the Syrian refugees or the pub owner or And I kind of, I mean, it it didn't make me angry,
Hmm. You didn't feel manipulated. Is that the kind of thing that you would be thinking would make you angry?
yes, though Loach's films has made me angry for other reasons. I
Sure.
mean, I think everybody hates who you preach to, particularly by people who you feel know less than you do about the subject, right? And sometimes with certainly with his Spanish film, I felt that way, right?
Mm.
He just come across as like Mr. Know-it-all, really. On the other hand, what I do value is that you get the sense that these are real stories, real speech, that I'm not even saying the working class, it's really the sub-pro. Yeah, people with no jobs, yeah, who are poor.
Yeah, I mean, you basically in this film see no one working, and
Exactly.
it's not to say that none of them have jobs. And I think the character mentioned she's got a cleaning job a couple of hours a week. You see an electrician who's obviously employed, but for the most part, this is people who are on their pensions or on the dole, and they are day drinking, and we don't have any. They're not working.
Yeah.
I suppose the pub owner as well is working. That's it.
Yeah. But it's a kind of a sub-pro community
Mm.
that is really nowhere else heard, and certainly nowhere else heard so systematically over the years as you see in Loach's films, and I really value that.
Mm.
And not only that, but I really value the combination, because there is such a little Englander mentality across the country, even where you least expect it, and kind of, middle class academics and so on. It's really strong, I find, as a foreigner myself. It's you know, it's there. So I think one of the things that I value in Loach's career is that the local and a voice, for the working class or even the sub-proletariat is somehow always tied into an internationalism, right? Yeah, so it's about Guatemalan cleaners and Syrian refugees, and
Mm.
yeah, kind of, the films often connect with events that are happening elsewhere that obviously affect the local, right?
Mm.
So that is very unusual, and I also value it. And then there are some films that I think deeply affected me. So what was The Wind in the Barley?
The Wind That Shakes the Barley,
I thought that was very beautiful.
which won the Palme d'Or.
Yeah. So it's almost like you have one idea of Loach, and then your experience of watching it affects you in unexpected ways, right? Like,
Mm.
in I, Daniel Blake, and even in that the last one that was
Sorry We Missed You.
and Sorry We Missed You. I mean, I think there were moments that I found deeply moving. Yeah, like that really affected me. This one, again, I kind of it's work that makes you think, because I do think it's cliched. I think it's didactic, right? I think I personally don't feel I'm learning anything from it. I mean, Loach just happens to share my politics, right? I if the effect is to convey an experience or truths or whatever to an audience, well, the audience that I'm sure he's hoping to reach is certainly not going to be reached at the cinema. It might be reached on television, if they can bother to watch it, because I can't imagine an ordinary audience kind of sitting through this type of film pleasurably. It moves too slow. It's too talking heads. It doesn't have set pieces or even narrative high points, right? Like, kind of, I think it's kind of visually boring, sonically boring. It's not shot in an interesting way. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it may play well on television. It's certainly a film I can imagine, like Channel 4 going the premiere of the TV premiere of Ken Loach's latest.
Yeah.
I can imagine, and I think
I can imagine,
and I don't think it's as slow as you suggest. I also was surprised at how how joyful it was at points. I mean, one thing that I think you expect from Loach, certainly the cliche of Loach, is just misery upon misery.
This is pretty miserable.
There is misery in here, certainly. But you also get quite a lot of. You start off with this thing of the family arriving, and the girl Yara is a photographer, and the film starts off with her photographs of the thing that you're hearing narrated. I mean, that is a little bit of aesthetic flair in a film that doesn't have very much of it. And then it becomes a live action scene, and a guy who is not keen on
foreigners
joining his town, and he's not even from there. He's from Scotland. Someone points out at one point, like, you're not a local either. He basically takes the camera and ends up smashing it. It's not quite an aggressive attack, but he definitely doesn't care what he's doing, and he's taking liberties, and the camera ends up broken. So you start off with, basically outright racism and misery, but once Yara goes to see the pub owner, what is his name? TJ, isn't it? And they start to develop this friendship. You all of a sudden you just start getting. I felt happy when they were together on screen. I liked their relationship. I thought, it also then ends up going, I think, so far that like the Syrian family are just perfect people, right? Like they can't possibly do any wrong. They're presented that way. That and anything bad is kind of something that happens to them. And I'm not saying that like they should be bastards or anything like that, but there's not a lot of complexity in their depiction.
No.
They are just pure victims.
Yeah.
Of obviously the crisis
too, and plucky and strong, because she stands up for herself and goes to ask for money to get her camera fixed from the guy who broke it, right?
Yeah.
So there's a pluckiness and a strength, and it's all virtues.
So on the one hand, that is really basic kind of character construction and storytelling. On the other hand, there was a certain pleasure in seeing kind of certain joys and things represented. The thing about going around to their house and serving tea and just getting to know them, it's like it's not a complex scene, but it was very nice to see. I like that. I think that's not.
I think the film, I welcome and I agree with it. I do think that there is something about people eating together. And I also think that things only ever get done collectively, right? Or in a collective setting, including things I think that you wouldn't expect to, I think even writing, which is very solitary, it needs a context, it needs editors and publishers and, people who circulate it and printers and, nothing comes out of an individual alone or a monadic kind of individual. So I like that depiction of a socialist politics, that it's about people coming together and doing things, and they have more strength than they think they do. And I believe in all of that. I do think that the way that it's dramatized is too pat, it's too easy, it's too naive. Certainly those communities would have to go, through a lot more trials, than you see depicted here before kind of coming together in the way that they do.
I certainly don't end up buying it at the end when they all go and visit the family.
Oh, that was such an
just lost their father
sequence.
I believed stuff up until then, even though, as you say, it was kind of pat. But that's the point at which I thought, no, you've stretched this a little too far. This isn't realistic anymore.
No. You see, what I would have liked is a more conventional drama, more visually and sonically interesting, that focused on the friendship between TJ, the pub owner, and is it David, his racist friend?
Sure.
Right.
His old friend, Charles, I think.
Okay, Charles, who they've grown up together, they're lifelong friends, and they really think alike in so many ways. And then one of them does something kind of really nasty, that you get the feeling is against his own beliefs, really, right? And then all the Syrian stuff happening as background context, kind of, that to me would be kind of a lot more interesting. Whereas here the focus is on, the community kind of interloping and how eating together makes the communities come together, which you see, I believe, but I don't. kind of the proof that we have of life in Britain is that actually there's very little intermingling or seepage or, the kind of, you have like Sikh communities that, stick together and Hindu communities that stick together. And
then you have the white British community that will just eat Indian food, but not
yes,
with Indians necessarily.
yes, they'll go to an Indian restaurant, but, I personally don't see much mingling really. I mean, you go on a train and kind of you see kind of a bunch of Asian girls together and so on. You very rarely see other things. I mean, I'm not saying they don't exist, but that is not to me kind of
no,
so I think that the film could have been kind of much much more complex, and actually I think it needs to have been. And and cinema is so great because you could suggest those complexities. You don't have to spell every fucking little thing out, which I think Ken Loach does. Also, there are some things that he deals with in some level, but not others. So a lot of the attacks, I thought it was interesting that you see them through social media, right? But actually, you see very little of the organizing through social media, right? Like, so they're talking about kind of places where they can do things. They're talking about, and they're still referencing to physical space, churches, pubs, whatever, the community center that was closed, and kind of I was surprised that a lot more of that kind of thing didn't just happen, for example, through text.
I was amazed. I mean, this really occurred to me, but I thought people are just constantly fucking knocking on doors, and I just thought, just fucking ring ahead. Like I couldn't deal with it if people kept coming around all day, knocking on my door, going, "I need a word immediately." Text me, ring me. I don't know why they're not. They've got phones. They're all on Facebook.
Yeah. So.
But I suppose that's also a way. Like, I mean, from a filmmaking perspective, that's a way of creating a scene. Is someone shows up and then you have a scene with the two of them together. But it did strike me as not very realistic, not very plausible. Like, it's just not how these interactions happen so much in real life anymore.
And also not elegant and so on. I mean, you could have dramatized the same thing visually through text or montages or, I mean, kind of just going door to door. First of all, it feels false, and then it's also dull. And yet, here's Ken Loach, I think quite a solitary voice, right? In his doggedness, in his leftism, in his pro-working class, is it fair to say almost a unique voice? Yeah, like, I mean, it's not that there are not other left-wing filmmakers in Britain, of course, or that, there are other works that focus on the working class, but I think kind of Ken Loach and Mike Leigh stand out, right?
Do any others have their level of recognition?
Well, I think the question also is, because Ken Loach and Mike Leigh are revered abroad, certainly in France, and I would argue in Spain, which is what I know, right? And held in much higher esteem than they are here in Britain, right? So, so is there something that French audiences and critics, for example, are saying that we're not seeing?
Or do they just love British misery?
I remember having this vivid memory of seeing Sweet 16 in a cinema in Paris, and they all loved it, right? They were responding to everything. And my feeling was that they just loved seeing the British be miserable, kind of, and poor and drug addicted and alcoholic. That was my thesis, or my conclusion, So, but I think obviously there has to be more than that. And with Mike Leigh, I get it, right? With Ken Loach, I mean, I'm much less convinced. And I think the reason why, I mean, I really do share a lot of Ken Loach's politics, and I'm so glad to hear these voices and all the things that I said earlier about kind of, linking the local with, kind of the international and so on. But I do think the films are didactic and predictable, and to me, well, it's ridiculous to say they don't work as cinema, because obviously they do to some audiences, and they are films, right? And you could say, well, it's a different aesthetic and it's a different way of making them, and you know. But you know, for me, I've never had like a great aesthetic experience through one of his films.
It's not a film that will challenge you. Ultimately, there's not a thing in it that I couldn't have expected, and or to expect it to be done in the way that it was, you know. And so when you see that the those bloody great big bully dogs, which are, you know, in the
They're
press
very
lately,
much in the news now, yeah. Bully.
But yeah, literally, yeah, bullying and going off the lead, and he's got this tiny little dog. You kind of know later on
What's going to happen?
they're going to come back together. You know, when the thing about getting the back room together, like, I mean, there are so many things to predict. One of them is that when all the racist mates, as I will call them for ease of pointing out who they are, when they want to use that back room, which has been closed for 20 years, for a meeting about, you know, what are we going to do about the Syrians, basically. Pub owner TJ declines, and he initially declines when Yara and what is the name of the sort of charity? Oh no, I think Laura. I think they asked to use it, and he also declines. I didn't see him declining immediately, but he does on basis that, like, essentially on a basis that I don't want to get too involved, and if I do, then my regulars will leave. But then he does open it up, and that becomes this meeting space and shared eating space.
Which is an underdeveloped point, because to me, you see, that would be a main point. And that is kind of like a moral and ethical dilemma. I mean,
that's where the most interest in the film was for me, was his development into someone who was doing something, and how long it would take him, and what were the reasons that he would or wouldn't. Those were the most interesting parts, and I agree that they weren't developed enough. It was something that you had to read into him.
I mean, imagine somebody losing their livelihood. I mean, I think however much, you know, I might want to help a cause, if it means kind of losing your livelihood, you find other ways of helping, right? Like, kind of, you know, it's not that you wouldn't help it, but you'd find other ways of helping it that wouldn't mean that you'd lose your livelihood. I think all of those things were erased too easily. And the same with, you know, turning down their friend. I understand that. You don't want some racist using, you know, you don't want the back of your pub used to fan the flames of racism. You know, on the other hand, you are compromising like 40 years of friendship and your, you know, your regular customers. So you have to find a way of like not letting it happen that doesn't alienate them completely, right? Like, I just thought those.
Yeah, well, he tries to, doesn't he? I mean, that's the thing. That's the thing that could have been developed. He tries to. So the reason that he gives for not opening it up is it's not safe. I haven't got insurance back there. You know, the pipes are fucked, the electric's fucked, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Which is then becomes the same reason that he gives to Yara and Laura. But then what happens is they go, okay, we will fix this up then, right? Something that's his dog dies, isn't it? And that's when he decides he's got to do something.
Yeah.
I think that's when that happens. And so he goes, right, we're going to fix it up then. Like, never mind the fact the electrics are fucked, we will get them unfucked. And so you go, okay, this was a reasonable excuse at the start when he gave it to his regulars. Now it's not anymore. I want to see the confrontation happen between them, and it doesn't.
And it doesn't. You know, so this thing of the racist sabotaging the plumbing and so on, you know, that comes as a revelation later. You never see it take place. You never see it even planned, or there's no tension created around it. I mean, there's just so many kind of loose ends, which to me is a form of bad cinema, right? Like the young kid who ends up at the banquet or whatever it's called, at the event where there's food, you know, who ends up waiting in the backyard. Who is he?
Yeah. I think you hear his name. I think he's Max, and he's mentioned a couple of times, but I didn't get a strong read on what his storyline was.
Yeah, who is he in relation to the other characters in the film? I mean, I have no idea.
The one thing that I read into that scene was he doesn't want to be seen there because his mates will accuse him of associating with the Syrians. Yeah. So I guess he must have been there.
He must have been one of the kids beating up the... Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But really wasn't singled out visually. No. I mean, I couldn't tell who he was. And of course, he's meant to be representative of a group. There are meant to be many others like him, yeah, that are hungry, yeah, and would appreciate the food, but don't want to be seen in a place with, people from Syria.
Yeah.
But I thought that was just kind of badly written, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Because that's the other thing is he's one of the. They talk about this isn't just for the Syrians in it. This is for the local kids in the area, especially whose parents have to choose between feeding them or keeping the heating on. Like they need something to eat as well, and this is to benefit everybody. And so, yeah, he's one of them. But it's not a strongly told story strand.
Also, and maybe this will come later, but because I think Ken Loach is a special case, right? And as I said, he is very highly respected abroad. He's very important historically in Britain, kind of, for all kind of cares and so on. I mean, his films have had a social impact. But I'm thinking, do you know of anyone who is like a Ken Loach fanatic who rewatches his films obsessively and who's the object of a cinephile passion?
No.
Me neither. It is just strange, that someone who is such an important, because usually to be an important filmmaker goes with that kind of passion. Yeah, they have their fans. It might not be you, but they have them, right? And you encounter them. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have yet to encounter a mad Ken Loach fan.
And his films are not talked about in terms of their aesthetic greatness. They're talked about as social importance, or or what they say about society and that sort of thing. It's no one, I think, ever expresses their love for his visual design, his filmmaking.
I'm saying, who did Ratcatcher?
Lynn Ramsey.
Because Lynn Ramsey deals with a lot of very similar kind of concerns and people. Yeah, it's always like sub-proles, and so on. But she's got mad fans, and rightly so.
Yeah.
Right. I've not.
But you see the difference. You see the difference in the filmmaking.
Yeah.
It's the aesthetic and poetic difference.
Well, I would say so, but I think the only point I'm making here is that, whatever the reason, it might be that, she's got kind of her legions of fans that are very passionate about her cinema. And I have yet to encounter, that type of engagement with Ken Loach.
Yeah, it may.
It might exist, but
I've been saying that it's filmmaking aesthetic thing. I think there may be some truth to that. It may also be that he's so outspoken in the press and in interviews and stuff. He's always got something to say. He's always trying to. And did you say it's something that you respect about him, that he is so outspoken about whatever it is he's making a film about, even if it's something like it's an issue that he might be new to, and suddenly acts as though he knows everything about it. He's also passionate, and maybe that is something that a huge number of people find a turn off. People don't like people who rock the boat.
I mean, I suppose I also think that there's a steeliness of purpose, and the certainty of cause, about the oppression of working class people and the voices and so on, that to me also limit his understanding of people. Yeah, that kind of, you never get a sense. So it's a weird thing because he often uses real people. They speak in kind of, in ways that kind of you understand as being from that class and so on and so forth. But actually the representation always seems not complex enough, to be people. The kind of people are much more contradictory and
everyone's representing something in the films. They're not. They very rarely come across as
people
really rounded. They represent a class or an age or a location or whatever it might be. Yeah, and they do here, I think, throughout.
The other thing that I thought was very nice about this film, just to turn the tables a little bit, I really liked that there was no sex in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That, you could imagine some other filmmaker turning the story of this pub owner and the Syrian refugee into a romance. Or, so I was glad that there wasn't. Though to return back to my earlier point about to me, not showing a real understanding of people. I liked that there was no sex or romance in it. I didn't like that it wasn't brought up.
It's brought up just the once when the one regular accuses him of saying, "Well, I bet you're fucking back there." And
as if it was something horrible.
Yeah.
Whereas it might have been very, very ordinary and simple for this Babano to find her attractive, but maybe too young, like
the same thing in I, Daniel Blake, though, because it was that Daniel Blake becomes friends with this sort of younger than him single mother, I think, and she, is going to the food bank and crying stuff, and they basically become friends. But it's the same thing. There's no sex in there, and I think he's got an ex-wife in there, or maybe I think he might be a widower. Here, TJ is divorced. There's a similar thing going on. Older man, younger woman, helping each other out, developing a friendship. But sex is going to be nowhere near it, and it's not even thought of as a possibility. And one of the reasons is this form of relationship, form of love that the older half has. I see that as a kind of formula.
Ken Loach is always one of those filmmakers that I wish I liked more.
Yeah.
That kind of, I've seen almost all of them, certainly since the 90s, and I'm glad I've seen them. And some of them, have really worked on me. But I wish I'd liked them more,
I think this is his most likable film for a while. It's the one that I have enjoyed watching the most. There are things that I like seeing. I like performances, for one thing, which we haven't mentioned, and I'm sure that so many of the actors here, I think you can tell, are non-professional, and some of them are quite stilted. But particularly the main two actors, whether they are professional, semi-pro or not, I don't know. Dave Turner plays TJ, and Ebla Mari plays Yara. The two of them are really good.
I thought that Yara was very charismatic. I didn't particularly think, that she was good. I thought she was kind of like a welcome presence.
Sure, okay. But Dave Turner, I think especially, he's gives a much better performance than I maybe expected. I liked him.
I liked his childhood friend, the actor who played his childhood friend.
Trevor Fox plays Charlie.
Yeah, I kind of, I thought he was very good.
I thought he had an interesting presence. I didn't think he was a very good actor.
Oh, I thought he was. I felt that I understood what he was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He tells you what he's thinking all the time.
No, that's not the case. That's why he stood out for me, because he opens the door, right, and you get a sense of what he's thinking.
Sure. Yeah. Although there was one point, and there was a guy at the back of the cinema, and it was quite a full cinema, we should say.
Yes.
Full of twinkly wrinklies.
Mike was the youngest person there
by a mile. But there was someone towards the back of the cinema on the left. You must have heard them as well.
Yes.
Giggling through some of the film, and I thought, and sometimes I thought he was laughing at the jokes, and sometimes I thought
he was laughing at
the film.
Yeah.
And I thought that's quite.
I think he was doing both.
Yeah. But I think the first point at which he laughed was early on when the regulars were in the pub and Charlie is talking about having lived here for so long and 40 years old, and that his house is only worth $8,000 and he's paid 5 times that years ago, and how's he ever going to live? And then he kind of breaks down and I think what that guy was responding to was that wasn't a great bit of performance, and I thought the same thing. It was.
Oh no, you see, I thought he was very good. I thought because the guy did laugh, but I thought he was laughing at the idea of a British person in a pub breaking down like that without being legless.
That might be the case as well, yeah. But the thing I found interesting about his presence, I think it comes down to his glasses. He's got a nice set of specs on him, and there's something about that. He looks like an architect, right? And it makes him stand out amongst basically everyone else that you see, who looks more sort of down and out. He kind of doesn't. And I'm not saying like he's secretly wealthy or something, but there's just something about his look that separates him. Yeah, there's something kind of more refined about him.
But you see, I like that. One of my criticisms about British cinema has been that British cinema is so anti-working class that it can't imagine working class people being beautiful, right? So, kind of you always have like, in films, like, working classness goes with a particular look, right? And it's not the same look, right? And so here we're not talking about culture or voice or whatever. Yeah. So kind of you can have someone who looks like Vivian Leigh or, Gene Simmons or whatever as like a middle class or upper class or aristocrat or none, right? But kind of, when you have like working class people, it's always, other actors. So I thought here it was very interesting because, he's a very handsome man.
Yeah.
I think it's partly what you're referring to. And why can't you be handsome and working class, right? Like it's absurd.
Handsome and kind of stylish. It's. I mean, there's an element of it
stylish,
how he chooses to
stylish with cheap clothes. Yeah, like he was wearing ordinary clothes. Yeah,
but there is something about him. It's funny. I suppose he's the one thing in the film that, to some extent, doesn't fit exactly the mold that you are expecting from this. Everyone else is dressed and looks the way you expect to look. They're kind of hangdog, or they're old and they're unshaven or whatever it might be. But not him, and actually in this film that really stands out to me.
But I like that because you also get the sense he's somebody who's worked all his life, who's done the right thing, who's bought his house.
Yeah.
He's got a child in a wheelchair, right? Like, yeah. So kind of, I think to me the kind of look kind of went with a respectable working class, person, but who was also tall and slim and good looking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And why shouldn't he be?
Yeah. So, like I said, I think it's a film of Ken Loach's that I've enjoyed the most. But it's also the one that I find the least challenging. As you say, it doesn't have a word to say that you don't expect or haven't heard before, and all the lessons that it's teaching you are lessons that you're well aware of. Whereas, and I think I probably thought more or less the same thing about I, Daniel Blake. Although I, Daniel Blake had a very evocative sense of just how crushing the Tory benefit system was.
Yeah,
it really evoked that.
I like that.
And Sorry We Missed You. I remember that. Again, I remember getting quite a vivid, or I have to listen back to the podcast to see what I really thought. But I seem to remember getting quite a vivid sense of again, just the crushing effect of the gig economy and how hard it is to find and keep work and that sort of thing.
Yes, I think I had mixed feelings about that, but overall, I agree with that.
And I suppose here, what is crushing about life for the locals is more vague. It's not really the focus of this. I think we get the thing about house prices are dreadful and everyone's in negative equity, and
there are no jobs.
They're pretty stuffed. There are no jobs,
and people are hungry.
But actually, the most concrete stuff we get, I think, is the stuff about their parents. That they kind of, in a sense, people are living on the backs of the memories of the miners' strike. I mean, that's what their dads were involved in. They would have been kids at the time.
I know. I thought that was a bit either false or out of touch, by the way. Because the miners' strike is the 80s, right? I mean, it was 40 years ago, right? There's been a lot of crisis since.
Yeah.
Kind of.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe this is me also having a bit of a stereotype about North as well. Then that didn't strike me as false. If anything, it struck me as a kind of minor criticism of, or it could have been a minor criticism of the way in which kind of former mining communities think, because there is a lot of remembering how hard it was at the time and never having, like celebrating when Thatcher died and so on.
Yeah.
Kind of, it's not something that's ever gone away. And there are good reasons.
Your father was a scab, says one about the other at some point.
Yeah. And there are good reasons to never forget that.
Okay, I take that back, because actually, I think someone my age, who is 60, 40 years ago would have been 20, and so would remember their parents working in a pit, or, might have worked in a pit themselves. I just thought it was so long ago, so it's one of those things that becomes a reference point in the culture, but that almost becomes a cliched reference point in the culture, that there have been so many other crises and hard times and cutbacks and austerity and, since then, that, you wonder why there's such a large part in the in the British imaginary, but maybe it has that larger part. It deserves to have that larger part because of the way the country was transformed. So,
I mean, deserves or not is another point, but I think it definitely does have that place. It's still something that people remember very vividly and live with those memories and that sort of thing. And like I say, I think you don't need to look any further than the response to Margaret Thatcher's death.
Yeah.
In I mean, all across the country really, but particularly in mining communities, there was some joy and there was anger and despair, and just it brought up all those memories vividly because all of a sudden the figurehead of it had the figurehead of the thing that had defined and changed so much of their lives was gone. That was kind of immense. I remember that quite vividly actually that day. Not that I have any particular connection to mining or anything, I don't, but I remember that day. It was the one last thing I wanted to point out before we go is I like the minor sort of sub focus that the film has on image making. That's something that's powerful. Starts off with these photos from the bus, ends with, or close to the end, is another montage of photos that Yara has been taking that she's got a camera back, which again is a little bit of a phony scene, but it's important that the film sees her photography and portraiture of the place as important. And her introduction to that back room comes through looking at those photos.
I thought that was very badly done.
Yeah.
I mean, I like the idea, but I don't like the way it was done. I mean, I think first of all, we should have seen more of the photos and the effect that they had of the people in the beauty salon and so on. And it should not have taken place in the pub or wherever it took place. Right, that whole scene where the photos,
yeah, it was in that back room.
Yeah, where those photos are being projected, and the Syrian music is being played. I thought that was like phony, because right now what you do is like you put them online, or you do a video montage of it with music, or it would circulate to people in different ways. The idea of people in a hall watching those photos, I didn't get. Also, I didn't like the photos, and I didn't like what they represented. Like, the idea of those photos is that they give back an image of themselves to the subjects. That is somehow transformative. That is not what it was before. And I think that idea is very badly conveyed.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with all that. I like the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, I do think, paradoxically, that, kind of when a Ken Loach film is showing, and this is maybe why I dragged you to it, one should go see it.
You didn't drag me.
Okay,
I was
good.
happy to go see it.
So I do recommend that people go see it, even though...
I think you're the one who felt dragged. You dragged yourself.
Okay, I dragged myself to see the film. And actually, I wish lots of other people would also drag themselves to see the film, because it does make you think about all of these things that we've been talking about today, and it's interesting to talk about, I think.
Yeah.
All right. So thank you all very much for listening. We are Eavesdropping at the Movies, and we are on
Apple Podcasts, Audible, Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. On social media, we're on Facebook and Twitter, or X, or whatever it becomes next week, at Eavesdrop Movies, Blue Sky, eavesdropping.bsky.social. And the website is eavesdroppingatthemovies.com.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.